There's a reason flash storage isn't called electronic non-volatile memory storage. IBM Flash Storage is fast, cloud-ready, scalable and surprisingly affordable. Order by the 30th of June and pay nothing for 90 days. Find out more at ibm.biz/flash offer.
Hi, I'm Adam Shepherd.
And I'm Jane McCallion.
And you're listening to the ITPro Podcast, your weekly guide to the most important topics in the IT industry.
So Adam, it's the final day of ITPro Live today, our first virtual conference.
That's right, the final day of our 5-day event is focusing on building a foundation for future success. If you want to know more about what's coming up in today's sessions, you can check out our mini-pod, which was released earlier this morning. But the week's gone quite well, I think. For our first virtual event, it's been an educational experience in a number of ways.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed it. I've been participating and I've been watching. And, it's just, we've managed to cover off such a range of issues, some really interesting speakers, really great insight. Now, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, oh my goodness, this sounds really interesting, but I haven't signed up yet, it's still not too late. You can do it as long as you're listening before midday. You can do it literally right now. You can listen to all the bonus mini episodes that we've put out over the course of the week to get an idea of what we've been speaking about and what our guests have been speaking about since Monday to today. And we'll put a link to that in the show notes.
And even if you're listening to this in the far-off future of next week, you can also sign up and watch all of the sessions on demand.
Coming up later in the show, we'll be talking to Dr Richard Searle, Senior Security Architect at Fortanix, about confidential computing, what it is, what it's for, and when we can expect to see it in action. But first, let's talk about this week's top news stories.
Our first story concerns Apple's annual conference, WWDC, which kicked off on Monday. Whereas WWDC usually sees crowds of developers and Apple fans packing the Steve Jobs Theatre at the company's Cupertino campus, this year Tim Cook was presenting to an empty auditorium thanks to coronavirus and the associated lockdown measures.
Yes, so it wasn't going to hold them back from having a little glimpse inside the campus, but it was strange to see actually, him appearing on stage just completely empty. It's quite sort of poignant, I guess. But it was Greg Federighi who presented most of it, and as far as I could tell, he was presenting from the holodeck of the Starship Enterprise. Let's just say it was very well done CGI, but there was a lot of CGI.
Among the announcements at WWDC was the expected launch of iOS 14, including a new apps library, redesigned widgets, and pinned conversations in messages.
Yes, they also unveiled Car Key, which does entirely what it sounds like. You can unlock your car with your phone. It'll initially be released exclusively to the BMW 5 Series 2021, which confusingly is actually coming next month, which you'll probably notice is still 2020. This seems like an immensely bad idea. It's just an immensely bad idea because, I don't know, if you lose your phone, it's one thing, does this mean somebody can make off with your car if they have your phone? I can't decide whether it's a gimmick or, like I say, a really terrible idea. In addition to iOS 14, we've also got iPadOS 14, which really is just a series of tweaks. Photos and music now have a different sidebar. Calendar has a bit more control. Universal search is quite interesting. You can search for apps, contacts, and more information, even stuff that's within apps in Pages and Keynote. There's also been some minor updates to watchOS. Activity has been relabeled fitness, which I take slight offence to personally, as I'm definitely not doing any fitness when I'm turning on my outdoor walk activity. And there are alarms for bedtime and wake up, and it does sleep tracking in between those.
There's also a new version of macOS, which has been labelled Big Sur after the mountain. But the biggest news is that Apple has finally pulled the trigger on ditching its relationship with Intel and making its own chips for its Mac devices.
Yes, it's a bit of a return to the old school here, because they was used to make their own chips for their Macs, and bringing in Intel was a big deal. So they are ARM-based chips, and that apparently presents a big problem, because while Apple is telling us just how super duper this is going to go, and it's going to be quick, it's going to work really well with its own software, which you'd hope, it won't work with Boot Camp.
That is a bit of a problem for organizations who want to use Windows-based applications on Mac devices. And it ties in neatly to what we were talking about last week with the news that Parallels is coming to Chromebooks to offer, in fact, this very feature. This puts Apple in an even more precarious position when it comes to the enterprise.
Yes, so Microsoft has said that there is no official way to install Windows onto Mac, as you would normally with Boot Camp when they're on ARM chips, and said that it only licenses Windows on ARM to OEMs. So, shots fired.
So the biggest event this week was obviously ITPro Live, but aside from that, we also had HPE Discover, which was done as a virtual event for the first time. And one of its biggest announcements was the Ezmeral software portfolio, including 2 products, ML Ops and Container Platform.
Yes, so this was an interesting announcement, and slightly, well, not unforeseen, but unusual. So the thing is that in 2017, HPE sold off its software business to Micro Focus in what they called a spin merge at the time. And now they have a software business. It was all kind of like, we've spun it off to be really streamlined, but here's a software business. So I was happy enough to join a press conference with the CEO, Antonio Neri, and basically asked him, is this just SBS in green clothing? And his explanation was that no, the old portfolio, great set of assets, whatever, but they weren't really coherent. They kind of weren't very strategic. They just had a bundle of good stuff, but not that you could do anything kind of particularly cogent with. Whereas Ezmeral apparently is going to be a bit more strategic, a bit more kind of working together in that way, and it also plays into GreenLake, which is their as a service platform thing, and Pointnext, which is their services business, so it can all be sold together through that. So I think it's a fair assessment on his point, even if it is a little bit SBS. There were various other announcements as well over the course of the week and the previous week regarding GreenLake, regarding Pointnext, regarding a back to work initiative as well that the company's working on. All of that coverage you can find on our site, and we'll leave some links in the show notes.
Our final story this week, a woman has been sentenced to 18 months community order for deleting data from the Dropbox account of her former company.
Yes, this is the story of Danielle Bully, the former director of a property marketing firm that she left on bad terms. And later on, she accessed their Dropbox, as he said, and deleted thousands of files, over 5,000, in fact. This tanked the business, and it went into liquidation, as had the business that it was previously founded from. Now, she's been prosecuted and convicted under the Computer Misuse Act, and apparently she's one of only very few who are actually convicted under the Act each year.
This is a real cautionary tale, I think, for companies in terms of limiting the access of departing employees to, well, any kind of shared corporate resources, really, but especially kind of important files and folders and cloud storage services, because all it takes is one disgruntled employee with the right password and all of your critical files can go up in smoke like that.
Yes, indeed. Stephen Harris, a detective constable at North Yorkshire Police's cybercrime unit, said almost exactly that. Ex-employees can pose a serious risk to a business because they're familiar with the company's IT infrastructure and procedures, and that can make it easy for them to carry out cybercrimes against former organisation.
It's super important to make sure that outgoing employees are stripped of any access rights as soon as possible, that any data they may have is recovered, and that you're using good security hygiene in terms of things like password reuse and multi-factor authentication to prevent ex-employees using what they know about your organization and its IT infrastructure to carry out this kind of sabotage, essentially, which is what it is.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that possibly it feels a little bit harsh if somebody's leaving, especially if it's on good terms, to be all kind of like, you know, at 6 o'clock on the dot on the day that they leave, right, that's it. All your access is kind of terminated. It feels very, very final. And at the end of the day, it is, but in the same way that you wouldn't leave them with the keys to the office either.
Well, exactly. Because it's very easy for these things to slip through the cracks. And before you know it, you've got a laundry list of ex-users who haven't actually been removed from the system and still have near unfettered access to everything that they did when they were still working.
Yes, and Computer Misuse Act aside, this is also a GDPR issue for what would be the victim company. We're going to take a quick break now, but joining us afterwards is Dr Richard Searle, Senior Security Architect at Fortanix, about confidential computing, what it is, what it's for, and when we can expect to see it in action.
The IBM Flash storage solution can be broken down into 3 S's. Speed, retrieve data fast and efficiently. Scalability, grow your storage as your business grows. Simplicity, easily migrate and integrate with existing systems. Oh, and there's a 4th. It's surprisingly affordable, with a recommended monthly price from as little as 1,300 kroner. Order by the 30th of June and pay nothing for 90 days. Visit ibm.biz/flash offer now.
Welcome back. Information security is a critical part of business and life nowadays. But while we can protect data at rest and data in transit via encryption, data in use is more difficult. Here to talk to us about that and the move to confidential computing is Dr. Richard Searle, Senior Security Architect at Fortanix. Richard, welcome.
Hi Adam, hi Jane, nice to be with you today.
So, Richard, can you tell us a bit about you and your role at Fortanix?
Yes, I work for Fortanix. We're based in Mountain View in California, and I'm working as a Senior Security Architect there. So my role is really to work with our large enterprise customers to establish what their security needs are, and then to map our products and solutions onto those needs so that they can deploy them globally.
So, Richard, we've heard a lot about cloud computing and edge computing and various other kinds of computing, but what is confidential computing?
That's a very good question, and I'm going to use an awful word, which is that the paradigm word, to say that this is a new paradigm in the computational sphere. So confidential computing, as you mentioned at the beginning, is able to protect data in use by performing computation in a hardware-based trusted execution environment. And that leverages a hardware-based root of trust to enable security of data and applications when they're actually being processed by the machine, and to prevent them being accessed by an attacker with privileged access to that machine or access from applications or services that are using it as a co-host.
So from some of my research, this seems to be a defense against memory dumps and that kind of thing. Is that true?
Yeah, that's a good example of one particular form of attack. So what confidential computing does is that it isolates the applications and the data so that they can't be accessed by a third party with privileged access to the machine. So not only does it protect against memory dumps, but it also shields the system from malicious root users, which is something that you mentioned earlier in the podcast. And it makes sure that the application and the data can be detected on the machine by the party that's using it, but not by anybody that's using that machine for a shared service, for example.
So this would foil attacks like Meltdown and Spectre, which we saw in previous years, correct?
Well, side channel attacks have been in the press now for since late 2018, and we're often asked about them. Our services implement all of the critical mitigations for the attacks that have been published, and often we're working very closely with our partners at Intel, who we work very closely with, and with other members of the community and the research groups themselves to understand how those attacks can be perpetrated and to defend against them. But in the real world, we haven't got any evidence of these attacks having been deployed and detected.
I'm not hugely surprised by that, I must say. Something we've covered on previous episodes is the tendency for attackers to take the path of least resistance, which 9 times out of 10 is things like phishing, business email compromise, password reuse, that kind of thing, rather than, advanced and fairly complicated exploits such as, side channel attacks or 0 days, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think what's important to remember is that the addition of confidential computing to your security arsenal is that it provides an additional layer of security. It's not something that stands in its own right as a defense against all attacks. And what you've got to consider is within that security model where confidential computing sits. And it's right at the center because it's really optimizing what's called the trusted computing base. It's providing the app that you're using and the CPU that's using it as the essential kernel of the security layer. And with a lot of the side channel attacks that we've just mentioned, what you've got to consider is the complexity and difficulty of perpetrating them. And often, in some cases, the first line of defense would be a lock on the data center door. So I tend to agree. But we don't take anything in security with we're not complacent about security. We work to address anything that's brought to our attention.
So can you give an example of what a typical use case would be for confidential computing? Am I going to see this in my computer sometime, or is this more for, say, sensitive industries that have very sensitive, very precious IP, such as, like, say, pharmaceuticals or finance or that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's a good question, Jane. And this type of technology is available on client-based machines today, but typically it's been directed towards the enterprise market, and that's firmly where the sort of future deployment of this is going to be, with public cloud services and enterprise computing. And it will still be relevant to us as individuals, because what we expect and what we're seeing with the customers we're working with is that they're deploying their applications to protect their sensitive intellectual property. That's particularly the case within the health and life sciences markets, where there's sensitive IP within the algorithms that are processing data. But the data itself obviously contains our private and sensitive information. And so this is an increasingly important area of computing moving forward, because it will allow both individuals and regulators to identify where data has been used on machines and that it's been protected properly when it's been computed and used.
So, Richard, you're also involved in the Confidential Computing Consortium. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, Jane. The Confidential Computing Consortium was set up last summer by the Linux Foundation, and Fortanix was an inaugural member. And the consortium features companies in the public cloud service space, hardware providers and applications developers, and also platform providers who are working to use confidential computing to deliver services for their customers. It's an open source initiative, so it also has projects assigned that are within the open source space to provide software development kits for use with trusted execution environments. And we're working very closely with all of the companies concerned to communicate the message around confidential computing and to help develop the projects and deliver them for the community.
So, Richard, what does the future hold for confidential computing? Where's this technology going?
Well, essentially, it's going to become a ubiquitous technology, as we've discussed previously. This is an additional layer of security that enables you to develop applications and services in a collaborative space where you can be assured that your application's code and also the data that you're processing, whether that be your own data or the data of a third party is secure. So I think there's going to be a groundswell of innovation around the use of confidential computing. That's certainly one of the things that the Confidential Computing Consortium is looking to develop. We have an established user group who are contributing their ideas and their use cases so that we can understand them and communicate them back to the market. And I think in the near future, you're going to see this becoming an ever-present element of applications and services that are deployed via the public cloud and within the large enterprise space.
Well, that's all we have time for this week. Thank you once again, Richard, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me onto the programme.
You can find links to all of the topics we've spoken about today in the show notes and even more on our website, www.itpro.co.uk.
You can also follow us on Twitter at ITPro, as well as Facebook and LinkedIn. You can also subscribe to our newsletter for all the latest from the site. Plus, next week, the new edition of ITPro 2020, our monthly digital magazine, is published. We'll leave a link in the show notes where you can sign up to receive that too.
Don't forget to subscribe to the ITPro podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever else you find podcasts to never miss an episode. And we'll be back next week with more news and analysis from the world of IT. Until then, goodbye.
Bye.
The ITPro Podcast is brought to you by the Dennis Podcast Network.
There's a reason flash storage is called flash storage and not electronic non-volatile computer memory storage. From quick and efficient data retrieval to instant scalability, everything about IBM flash storage is fast. It's also cloud-ready and surprisingly affordable, with a recommended monthly price of 2,200 kroner for 24 terabytes of all flash. Order by the 30th of June and pay nothing for 90 days. Find out more at ibm.biz/flash offer.